The morning they were told to leave, the sky was the color of old dishwater and a thin November rain was coming down sideways off the mountain. Mara was 18 years old and standing on the porch of a house that had never really been hers, watching her sister drag a trash bag full of clothes across the wet grass. Della was 15. She was still wearing her pajama pants and one sneaker because the other one was somewhere inside, and their stepmother had locked the door before she could go back for it. Their father had been dead for 6 weeks. Mara had not cried yet. She did not know exactly why, except that crying felt like something that came after the thing was finished, and the thing was not finished. There were still decisions to make. There was still Della to think about. Their stepmother, Renee, had said it plainly through the screen door. The house was in her name. Had been since she and their father remarried in 2019, 3 years after their mother passed. She was not throwing them out, she said, using the word that made it sound gentle. She was asking them to make other arrangements. She had a sister in Asheville who had offered her a room. She needed to sell the property quickly. It was all very unfortunate. Mara had looked at Renee through the screen for a long moment without speaking. Then she picked up Della's trash bag and walked to the car. The car was their father's old Subaru, a 2007 with 218,000 miles on it, and a crack in the windshield that turned every set of headlights into a spider's web. Renee had not tried to take the car. Mara suspected she did not want the hassle of explaining that, too. They sat in the driveway for a while. The rain came down. Della found her missing sneaker in the bottom of the trash bag and put it on without saying anything. She was the kind of girl who made practical adjustments to terrible situations. Mara had always loved that about her. "Where are we going?" Della finally said. Mara looked straight ahead through the cracked windshield. "I need to call Mr. Pruitt," she said. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Raymond Pruitt had been their grandfather's attorney for 30 years and had handled the estate when Elias Vayne died the previous spring. He was a soft-spoken man in his 70s with a habit of letting long silences sit between sentences, as if he were giving the words room to breathe. Mara had met him twice, once at the reading of her grandfather's will, and once when she signed the paperwork confirming she understood the terms of what had been left to her. What had been left to her was a barn, not the farmhouse on the property, which had gone to her father, not the 11 acres of pasture land, which had also gone to her father, and which now presumably belonged to Renee along with the house. What Elias Vayne had left specifically and deliberately to his oldest granddaughter Mara was a single structure, the old dairy barn at the western edge of the property, along with the 1/4 acre of ground it sat on. At the time of the reading, Mara had not known what to make of it. Her father had made a sound she still could not categorize, somewhere between a laugh and something worse. Her Aunt Cecily, who had driven up from Charlotte for the occasion, said out loud that it was a shame the old man had lost his mind in those last years. The barn had not housed animals since 1987. Half the roof was gone. The county had flagged it for structural concerns in 2021. Renee had not said anything at the reading, but she had exchanged a look with Cecily that Mara felt in her sternum. Mr. Pruitt had called her the day after the reading to explain that the barn deed was fully legal and recorded, that it was hers free and clear, and that her grandfather had been entirely sound of mind when he directed it. He had said one other thing that had stayed with her. He said, "Your grandfather was very specific. He wanted you to have the barn and not anyone else." She had not known what that meant. She still did not know. But she was 18 years old with a 15-year-old sister and a cracked windshield car and nowhere to go, and the barn was the only thing in the world that belonged to her. She called Mr. Pruitt from the driveway. He answered on the second ring. She told him what had happened in 3 sentences. He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "Come to the office. There are some things I should have told you sooner." Raymond Pruitt's office was in a 2-story brick building on the main street of Harlan, a 20-minute drive south through the mountains. He met them in the lobby himself and brought them upstairs to a room with tall windows and too many bookshelves and a coffee maker going in the corner. He poured 2 cups without asking and set them on the table in front of the girls and sat down across from them. He looked at Mara for a moment. Then he opened a file folder and slid a manila envelope across the table. "Your grandfather left this for you," he said. "He was specific that I give it to you only if certain circumstances arose." He believed they would. He was apparently correct. Mara opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter in her grandfather's handwriting, the same compact, careful script she remembered from birthday cards all her life. There was also a photograph, old and slightly out of focus, of a man she did not recognize standing in front of what was clearly the barn. And there was a key, heavy brass, old-fashioned, the kind that belonged to something serious. She put the key on the table and unfolded the letter. Her grandfather had written it in the spring, 2 months before he died. He had not told her father he was writing it. The letter was 3 pages long. Mara read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment the way she had been doing since she was a small girl when she needed to think without her face giving anything away. Della had been watching her. "What does it say?" she asked quietly. Mara set the letter down. She looked at Mr. Pruitt. "Did you know?" He nodded slowly. "Your grandfather told me the general outline. Not every detail. He felt that was yours to know first." They drove out to the barn that afternoon. The Vayne property sat at the end of a gravel road off Route 9, back against a ridge of second-growth hardwood that had been coming in slowly for 40 years over what had once been pasture. The farmhouse was visible from the road, a white 2-story with green shutters where Renee presumably still was. Mara took the narrow track that ran along the fence line to the west, the one she had ridden her bicycle on as a child, and followed it to where it ended in a clearing about 300 yards from the house. The barn was larger than she remembered. Memory had a way of shrinking things, but this one had kept its size. It was post-and-beam construction, old-growth hemlock, the siding weathered to a deep silver gray. The roof was the problem. The eastern third had caved some years back, and the boards beneath it had rotted through, leaving a gap open to the sky like a missing section of skull. But the western 2/3 still stood solid, the old timbers dark and dense, the foundation stones set so deep and level they looked like they had grown from the ground. Mara parked and got out. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet leaves and something underneath that, a darker smell, the smell of old wood and cold earth, and something faintly mineral she could not name. Della stood beside her looking up at the barn. "It's big," she said. "Yes," Mara said. "Are we actually going to live here?" Mara did not answer right away. She looked at the building for a long time with the key in her hand. Their grandfather's letter had said, "Go into the barn. Take the key. There is something inside the west wall I need you to find. I should have told you before now. I am sorry I waited. There are reasons, and I will try to explain them, but first you need to see it for yourself." "I think so," Mara finally said. "Yes." They walked to the main doors, 2 massive sliding panels on a steel track. One of them was jammed and would not move, but the other rolled back with effort, grinding on grit in the track, and the smell that came out of the opening was exactly the dark mineral smell Mara had noticed outside, only stronger and older. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The interior was cathedral scale. Even with the collapsed section of roof, the standing portion of the barn stretched 60 feet from the doors to the back wall, the ceiling 30 feet overhead at the peak. Light came down from the damaged east end in long slanted columns through the hay dust still moving in the air. The floor was original, wide hemlock planks worn smooth by a century of animals and boots. Old stanchions still lined the north wall, iron rings set into the stone. High on the south wall, a faded painted advertisement for a dairy cooperative that had closed before Mara was born. And there was the west wall. Her grandfather's letter had told her to look at the west wall. It had said, "You will see that it does not match the others." She walked to it slowly. He was right. The wall was built differently from the others. The siding boards were horizontal where the rest of the barn's exterior siding ran vertical, and the interior face of the wall was sheathed in old tongue-and-groove pine that had been painted over at some point, a dark barn red that had faded and flaked but still covered the wood in patches. The other interior walls were bare timber framing with the siding visible between the studs. This one was finished, enclosed. Mara put her hand flat against the pine sheathing and pressed. It was solid. No give. She looked at the key. Then she started walking the length of the wall from south to north, running her palm along the painted pine, looking for the thing her grandfather had written that she would find. He had called it, in the letter, the door. He had said it was the most important thing he ever did and the thing he most regretted having to do, and that those 2 facts were not in contradiction. She found it about 2/3 of the way along the wall. The outline was subtle. Someone had done a careful job of blending it into the surrounding surface, painting over it until the seam was nearly invisible, caulking the gap, so the joint looked like a natural line in the old boards. But when you pressed your palm against it and slid your hand along the wall, you could feel the difference. The rest of the sheathing had the give of old wood, the faint flecks of boards attached to framing with a gap behind them. This section did not flex. Behind it was something solid. And when Mara got down on one knee and looked at the base of the wall, she could see, under 40 years of grime and sawdust, the faint line where the bottom of the door met the floor, and beside it, set so flush into the surrounding wood that it was nearly invisible, the brass escutcheon plate of a lock. Della had come up behind her. She said nothing. She crouched beside her sister and looked. Mara put the key in the lock. It turned. She pulled and the door opened outward, a panel of old pine about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, heavier than it looked, the hinges stiff with decades of disuse, but functional. The wood swinging free in a single slow arc that stirred up a smell Mara had no frame of reference for. Cold air, much colder than the interior of the barn. Stone and earth and something else, something faintly sweet and dry, like old cedar or old paper. Behind the door was a room. Not a closet. A room. Della made a sound beside her that was not quite a word. The room ran the full length of that western wall and extended back further than the barn's exterior suggested it should, which meant that her grandfather had built out below ground. The floor of the room a full 4 feet lower than the barn floor, accessed by a short flight of stone steps. The walls were mortared fieldstone, the ceiling supported by hemlock beams that matched the rest of the barn's framing. The space was roughly 30 feet long and perhaps 15 wide. Dry, despite being partly underground. Because the foundation drainage was good and the ventilation was coming from somewhere she could not yet identify, a faint movement of cold air that smelled of the hillside behind the barn. Her grandfather had built this room himself. His letter said so. He had begun it in the winter of 1981, working alone on weekends over the course of 2 years, telling no one, including his wife, what he was doing. He was an engineer by training, had worked for a construction company in Asheville for 20 years before coming back to the family property when his parents aged out of running it. He knew what he was doing. The room was built to last. He had not built it to hide anything. He had built it to keep something safe. They stood in the doorway at the top of the stone steps and looked into the room, and Mara felt the strangeness of it settle over her like a change in weather. The room was full. Not cluttered, not chaotic. Full in the way that a room becomes when someone has used it carefully and consistently for a long time. Along the north wall, a workbench, 12 feet of solid oak, with tools hung above it on a pegboard. Woodworking tools, joinery tools, a hand plane whose blade still had the blue glint of a recently sharpened edge. On the south wall, shelving built floor to ceiling, and on the shelving, in wooden crates and flat archival boxes and carefully wrapped bundles, things she would need days to fully understand. Against the back wall, a wood stove, small and cast iron. Its pipe running up through the ceiling through a sealed chimney, she could now understand was hidden inside the exterior wall's modified framing. A folding cot in the corner with a rolled sleeping bag on top of it, the kind of setup a person might maintain not because they slept there often, but because they wanted the option. And on the workbench, a photograph in a simple wooden frame. Her grandfather, young, sitting at the workbench in this room. He was maybe 40 years old. He was smiling at whoever held the camera. Mara walked down the steps. She stood in the room for a long time. The letter had explained some of it, but the room explained more. Her grandfather had spent 4 decades maintaining this space. The shelving was dusted. The tools were oiled. The wood stove had a small stack of split kindling beside it, and a box of matches on top of it, which meant he had been here recently, had been keeping it ready. She picked up the photograph. Turned it over. On the back, in his handwriting, was a date, March 1983, and below the date, for whoever comes next. I built this so there would be something to come next to. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She had not understood her grandfather when he was alive. He was a quiet man. The kind of quiet that is not shyness but something closer to discipline, a habit of holding things in until he knew what they were. He had been kind to her and Della in a way that was specific rather than general. He remembered what they said. He showed up. He never talked about money or property or the future, never dropped any hint that there was something waiting for them. But he had looked at Mara sometimes, In the way that she now understood, a long, careful look that she had read as thoughtfulness and now understood was something closer to intention. He had seen her before she had seen herself. She put the photograph back on the workbench. She went to the shelving and began to look. The archival boxes were labeled in his handwriting, careful and systematic. She opened the first one she touched and found inside it a collection of documents. Land surveys going back to 1908, deed abstracts, a hand-drawn map of the property's water sources. In the next box, correspondence, letters between her grandfather and various agencies and attorneys spanning 30 years, all relating to the property, its legal status, its history. In a flat wooden crate wrapped in an old canvas drop cloth, she found what she first took to be planks of wood, but when she lifted one edge of the cloth, she saw the frame and then the painted surface, and she stopped moving for a moment. Paintings. A dozen of them, canvas on stretcher bars, wrapped carefully in acid-free tissue inside the crate. She lifted one free. A landscape, mountain country, a painter she did not recognize, the style somewhere in the early 20th century. She lifted another. A portrait, a woman in a dark dress, formal and severe, with eyes that seemed to adjust to whatever angle you looked from. On the back of each stretcher bar, a small paper label in unfamiliar handwriting. A name, a date, a provenance notation. She did not have the knowledge to understand what she was looking at. Not yet. But she had enough knowledge to understand that these were not things her grandfather had bought at a yard sale. She stood in that underground room in the barn she now owned, on the quarter-acre of ground that was the only legal ground under her feet in the world, and she looked at the shelves her grandfather had built with his own hands, and she understood that the thing he had left her was not a structure. It was a foundation. It was everything he had spent a lifetime gathering and holding for her, kept behind a door he sealed in the winter of 1981 and never told anyone about, waiting for the day she would be the one to open it. Outside, through the open door of the barn and through the gap in the collapsed roof, the sky had turned a pale winter gold the way it did for 20 minutes some November afternoons before the light dropped entirely behind the ridge. Della was sitting on the workbench with her knees pulled up, looking at the tools on the pegboard with a focused expression that Mara recognized. That was Della solving something. We could fix the roof, Della said. The east end. If we fixed the roof, it would stop the rot. Mara looked at her sister. We'd need to stay somewhere while we figured out how to do that, she said. The woodstove works. She nodded at it. He kept kindling. He had the room ready. Mara said nothing for a moment. She looked around the room. The cot in the corner. The box of matches on the stove. The shelving her grandfather had built board by board in secret over 2 years because he wanted there to be something for whoever came next. She walked to the woodstove and opened its door. Inside, the firebox was clean, the grate intact. A single folded piece of paper sat on top of the kindling. She picked it up. It was in his handwriting. It said, "I thought you might be cold. Start here." Mara read it twice. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. Then she picked up the box of matches and lit the fire. The first night was the coldest Mara had ever spent awake. The woodstove worked, but it was small and the room was stone, and the heat it made was the kind that stayed close to its source and did not travel far. She gave Della the cot and the sleeping bag and pulled every piece of extra clothing she owned out of the trash bag and layered it on herself, and sat in the old folding chair she had found leaning against the back wall and listened to her sister breathe and watched the orange line of light around the stove door and did not sleep until almost 4 in the morning. She was not miserable. That was the strange part. She had expected to be miserable, and instead she felt something closer to clarity. The specific sharpness that comes when every unnecessary thing has been removed, and what remains is only what is real. She had a roof over her head, which was more than she'd had 8 hours ago. She had a fire. She had Della. She had a room full of things she did not yet understand. She thought about her grandfather for a long time in the dark. Elias Vayne had not been a man who explained himself. He had been present in the way that solid structures are present. You did not notice them until you needed to lean against them. He came to her school plays and sat in the back. He showed up the week after her mother died and fixed the broken gutter on the house without being asked and left before dinner. He taught her to drive in the parking lot of the old co-op when she was 15, in the same truck she had learned later he'd had for 30 years. He was not a man who made speeches. He was a man who did things and left them there to be found. She understood him better now than she ever had when he was alive. In the morning, she drove into Harlan and bought 2 sleeping bags at the hardware store and a propane camp lantern and 20 pounds of firewood and a bag of groceries, and came back and set up the room properly. She swept the floor. She organized the kindling. She found a second folding chair behind the shelving and set it up facing the first one. And that simple act of making 2 chairs face each other in a space made the space feel less like hiding and more like living. Della, who had slept 9 hours without moving, woke up and looked around the room in the lantern light and said it looked like a ship's cabin. Mara thought that was probably right. Small and self-contained and going somewhere. They spent the second day doing what needed doing. Mara called her school and explained that she was dealing with a family situation and would be in touch about her schedule. She did not explain further. She was a senior with a 3 for average and had not missed more than 4 days in 4 years, and the guidance counselor on the other end of the phone, a woman named Mrs. Hensley who had always been decent to her, said take the time you need and call me Thursday. Della's situation was more complicated. She was a sophomore at Harlan County High, and missing school was not something Mara was prepared to let slide. She drove her in the next morning and sat in the parking lot until the bell rang and watched her sister walk through the front door in her 2-day-old clothes without looking back, and felt something she could not name, a feeling somewhere between pride and fury at the circumstances that required that kind of toughness from a 15-year-old. She went back to the barn and spent the day in the room. She went through every box on the shelves. She worked methodically from south to north, starting at floor level, opening each container carefully and documenting what was inside in a notebook she had bought at the hardware store along with the sleeping bags. Her grandfather had organized everything. Every box was labeled. Every document was in its proper place. He had been doing this for 40 years, and it showed. The system was clear once she understood the logic of it, which took most of the morning. The land records were the first category. He had assembled a complete legal history of the property going back to the original land grant in 1847. Every deed transfer, every survey, every tax record, every legal dispute. There had been 3 significant disputes over water rights on the property, all of them resolved in the Vayne family's favor, all of them meticulously documented. The most recent was from 2009, when a development company out of Knoxville had approached him about purchasing the creek-fed lower pasture. He had declined. The correspondence was in a separate folder, and the tone of it was polite and absolute. Elias Vayne had a way of writing that left no room for negotiation without ever raising his voice. The second category was harder to categorize. It was a collection of what she eventually understood were appraisal records. Certificates, letters from institutions she had to search on her phone to understand the significance of auction records. She could not make full sense of them yet, but the pattern was clear enough. Her grandfather had been acquiring things for a long time, carefully and selectively, and having them properly evaluated, and keeping the records of those evaluations alongside the objects themselves. Which brought her to the paintings. She went back to the wooden crate, and this time she lifted each canvas out fully and leaned them against the shelving in a row and stood back and looked at them in the lantern light. There were 14 in total. 2 were landscapes, mountain country in both cases, painted in a style that felt early American to her untrained eye. 1 was a still life, fruit and a pewter pitcher on a dark table, the paint applied thickly enough that she could see the texture of it from 3 feet away. 4 were portraits. 3 were what she thought might be called genre scenes, figures in domestic settings, a woman at a washstand, a man reading by lamplight, 2 children in a garden. The remaining 4 were harder to classify, looser in their brushwork, more abstract in intention. Each one had a label on the back of its stretcher bar. Name, date, provenance notation. She photographed each label carefully with her phone. That evening, after she picked up Della, she searched the names. She sat in the front seat of the car in the barn's clearing with the engine running for heat and went through her photographs one by one. Some of the names she could not find. Some of them led to results that were thin or uncertain. But 3 of the names led her to auction records, to museum collection listings, to academic papers and art history journals she could not fully access without institutional login. And beside 2 of those names, in search results from a major auction house's archive, she found sale records for works attributed to those artists, with numbers attached that made her sit very still in the cold car for a long time. She drove to Mr. Pruitt's office the next morning without calling ahead. He was in, and he saw her immediately, which told her something about how seriously he was taking all of this. She put her phone on his desk with the photographs pulled up. She said, "I need you to tell me what you know about the paintings." He looked at the photographs for a moment. Then he looked at her. Then he sat back in his chair and folded his hands the way he did when he was about to choose his words with care. "Your grandfather," he said slowly, "began collecting in the 1970s. He started with local painters, artists from this region who were not well known, but whose work he admired. Over time his eye developed. He learned. He read extensively. He made connections with dealers in Asheville and Knoxville and eventually in larger markets. He was not a wealthy man. Everything he acquired slowly and with great patience, often buying works that others had overlooked or undervalued." Mara waited. "I believe," Mr. Pruitt said, "and I must be clear that I am not an expert in this area, that some of what he collected has become considerably more valuable than what he paid for it. He believed this to be the case. He spoke to me about it generally before he died. He said he had been waiting for the right time to have everything properly assessed, and that he intended to do so in the spring. He did not get to the spring." Mara looked out the window at the street below. A woman was parking a pickup truck. An ordinary Tuesday in Harlan, Kentucky, and she was sitting in an old attorney's office trying to understand the shape of a life her grandfather had lived entirely in secret. "He kept it all in the barn," she said. "Yes, he felt it was safe there. He had built the room specifically, as I understand it, with climate considerations in mind. He was an engineer. He understood what paintings needed in terms of temperature and humidity. He was proud of the room. He spoke of it as the best thing he had ever built." She thought of the stone walls, the dry air, the faint movement of ventilation she had noticed the first night. She had not understood it then. She understood it now. Why didn't anyone know? Mr. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather was a private man. He distrusted the kind of attention that wealth brings. He had seen what it did to people he knew. He wanted the collection to remain intact and to go to someone he trusted to handle it with care. He watched you, Mara. For years. He watched how you made decisions." She thought of all the times she had felt her grandfather's eyes on her without being able to read what was behind them. "What do I need to do?" she said. He reached into his desk drawer and produced a business card. "You need to speak with this woman. Her name is Dr. Caroline Firth. She is a professor of American art history at the University of Tennessee, and she has done authentication work for several major auction houses. Your grandfather had already made contact with her. She was expecting his call in April." Mara took the card. "She has agreed," Mr. Pruitt continued, "to make the drive up here to evaluate what you have, given the circumstances. I took the liberty of reaching out to her last week after our first meeting. She is available on Friday." He had already done it. He had seen it coming and had already done it, the same way her grandfather used to fix the gutter without being asked. "Thank you," she said. He waved a hand. "Your grandfather was my friend for 30 years. This is the last thing I can do for him." She drove back to the barn and sat in the room with the lantern on and the stove going and the 14 paintings leaning against the shelving, and she tried to think clearly about what was happening. It was difficult. The scale of it kept slipping in her mind, too large to hold steady. She had been homeless 4 days ago. She was still homeless in every practical sense. She and her sister were sleeping in a stone room under a barn with a camp stove and 2 sleeping bags. Della was going to school in clothes she'd been wearing for 3 days because most of what they owned was still at the house in garbage bags that Renee had said they could pick up but had not yet allowed them to come for. She needed to think about the short term, the roof, the barn, what it would take to make this a real place to live, not just a place to survive. She called Bert Caswell, who had done work for her grandfather over the years and whose number she found in the contacts of the old flip phone she had taken from the house the day they left, the one her father had kept on the kitchen counter and never thrown away even after he got a smartphone. Bert answered on the 3rd ring, and she explained who she was and what she needed. He came out the next afternoon. He was a man in his 60s with a white beard and the careful movements of someone who had spent decades not hurrying, because hurrying was how people got hurt on roofs. He walked the exterior of the barn twice without speaking. He went inside and looked up at the collapsed east section for a long time. He tested 3 of the standing rafters with his hand and his weight and made a sound in his throat that was neither alarm nor reassurance. Then he came back outside and stood with her in the clearing and looked at the building. Your grandfather kept this place up until about 3 years ago, he said. Before that it was in good shape, considering. The east section let go in that ice storm in 2021. He wasn't well enough by then to deal with it. Can it be repaired? She said. He looked at her. The western 2/3 is solid. Foundation's good. Frame's good. That's the old-growth hemlock, and it doesn't rot the same way the new-growth stuff does. If you put a metal roof on the whole structure and sistered the compromised rafters in the east section and rebuilt the decking, you'd have a barn that would outlast both of us. How much? He named a number. It was not a small number. It was also not, she had begun to understand, an impossible one, depending on how things went on Friday. Let me see what I can do, she said. He nodded as if this was a reasonable answer. He gave her his card and told her the standing offer was good for 60 days. Then he drove out the gravel track in his truck, and she stood in the clearing and looked at the barn for a long time in the thin November light. Della found the journals on Thursday. She had been exploring the shelving systematically in the way she approached most things, which was quietly and thoroughly, and without announcing herself. Mara came into the room after picking her up from school and found her sitting cross-legged on the cot with a book in her lap, reading with the focused stillness she got when something had fully captured her. The journals were on the top shelf of the north section, a row of them, 22 in total, spanning from 1979 to the previous spring. Their grandfather's handwriting in each one, the same compact script as the letter, filling page after page. He wrote everything down, Della said without looking up. She turned a page. About the paintings. Where he found them. What he paid. What he thought they were. She paused. He made mistakes sometimes. He writes about them. Mara came and sat beside her and read over her shoulder. He had made mistakes. He wrote about them honestly, the same way he wrote about everything else, with a precision that did not soften the error but also did not catastrophize it. He had bought 3 works early on that he later concluded were not what he had believed, and he had sold them at a loss and written a full accounting of what he had misread and why. The lesson in each case was woven into the entry without being stated as a lesson. He simply described what had happened and what he now understood. But the works he had kept, the 14 in the crate, those he wrote about with a different quality of attention. He returned to them in the journals over years. He would describe going back to look at a particular painting and what he saw in it that time that he had not seen before. He tracked the provenance research he did, the letters he wrote to historians and dealers and museum curators, the gradual building of the case for each work's attribution. He was meticulous and patient and completely self-taught and absolutely certain of his own eye in the way that people are certain of things they have tested repeatedly under difficult conditions. Della set the journal down and picked up another one, later in the sequence. He wrote about us, she said. Mara looked at her. Here. She held the journal out and pointed to an entry from 4 years back. The entry was a full page. Their grandfather had written about a visit, the previous Thanksgiving, when both girls had come with their father to the property for dinner. He described watching them across the table. He described Della's habit of listening without speaking until she had something specific to say. He described Mara's way of noticing things. A dripping faucet she had pointed out without making a point of it. A rotting board on the porch step she had avoided by instinct rather than being told. He wrote, She sees the way a builder sees. She looks at a thing and reads its condition. I do not know yet what she will do with that, but I believe she will use it. Mara read it twice. She handed the journal back to her sister. She stood up and went to look at the paintings. Dr. Caroline Firth arrived on Friday morning in a white Land Cruiser that was not new but was meticulously maintained, which Mara took as a good sign about her professional habits. She was a woman in her mid-50s, compact and direct, with reading glasses on a cord around her neck and a canvas bag that turned out to hold equipment Mara did not fully recognize. UV lamps, a loupe, various instruments for examining paint layers and canvas condition. She did not make small talk. She shook Mara's hand, said she was sorry for the circumstances, and asked to see the room. She spent 3 hours with the paintings. Mara and Della sat on the cot and watched without speaking. Dr. Firth moved through the 14 canvases with a methodical calm, spending varying amounts of time with each one. She used the UV lamp on 6 of them. She examined the backs of the stretcher bars and the canvas weave and the edge of the paint at the borders. She read the provenance labels. She took photographs. She made notes in a narrow leather notebook in handwriting so small Mara could not read it from across the room. At one point, she stopped in front of the fourth portrait, a painting of a woman in a blue dress, and stood very still for a long moment with her arms crossed and her head tilted slightly. Then she leaned forward and looked at the lower right corner with the loop. Then she straightened up and wrote something in her notebook. She did not react otherwise. When she was finished, she put her equipment back in the canvas bag and accepted the cup of coffee Mara offered from the small percolator she had bought at the hardware store. She sat in the folding chair and looked at the paintings from across the room the way a person looks at something they are still deciding about. "I want to be careful about what I tell you," she said finally, "because authentication is a process and I cannot give you definitive conclusions from a single visit. What I can tell you is that several of these works warrant serious further investigation." Mara waited. Dr. Firth set down her coffee. "Your grandfather's eye was remarkable. The attributions he made in his records are in most cases consistent with my preliminary assessment. The landscape on the far left I would want to send for technical analysis. Infrared reflectography, paint sampling, before I said anything publicly. But the signature is consistent, and the style is consistent, and the provenance chain your grandfather assembled is more thorough than what I see from professional dealers 9 times out of 10. She paused. "The portrait in the blue dress," she said, "is the one I want you to be patient about." Mara looked at it. It was not the most visually striking of the 14. It was quieter than some of the others, smaller, the colors muted. But there was something in the face of the woman in it that she had noticed even on the first day, the quality of attention in the painted eyes that seemed to shift with your angle of approach. "Your grandfather believed it was significant," Dr. Firth said. "His notes, which Mr. Pruitt shared with me before I came, indicate he spent 15 years tracking the provenance of that particular work. He wrote to 3 different museums about it. He received responses from 2 of them." She reached into her bag and produced a folder. Inside were photocopies of letters. She laid them on the workbench. One of the letters was from a curator at a museum in Virginia. The other was from an archivist at a university collection in Philadelphia. Both letters were substantive, not dismissive. Both expressed interest in the work and asked follow-up questions. Both had been responded to by her grandfather, the responses filed neatly in the folder beneath the originals. Mara read through them slowly. Della read over her shoulder. "If his attribution holds," Dr. Firth said, "that painting is not a minor discovery." "What does that mean?" Della said. "It means," Dr. Firth said, with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to raise hopes carelessly, "that the authentication process needs to happen fully and properly before anyone says anything to anyone. It means you should not discuss this outside of this room until I have completed my assessment. It means you need legal representation, specifically someone who handles art and estate matters, not just property law. And it means," she looked at Mara directly, "that your grandfather may have spent the last 40 years building something considerably more significant than anyone around him understood." After she left, Mara stood in the clearing for a long time. The November light was doing what it did in the late afternoon, going gold and then going fast. The ridge behind the barn was dark already, the hardwoods stripped of their leaves, the silhouettes of the upper branches against the sky like cracks in something. The barn stood in the clearing solid and silver gray and enormous in hers. She thought about her Aunt Cecily saying at the reading that it was a shame the old man had lost his mind. She thought about Renee's look, the one exchanged across the room. She thought about her father, who had inherited the house and the 11 acres and had not looked inside the barn in years. She thought about all the ways a person could stand next to something their whole life and not see it. Her grandfather had seen her. He had built a room in secret and filled it over 40 years and locked the door and left her the key and written her a letter that said go find it. And she had. And now she was standing in a clearing in November with a 15-year-old sister and a camp stove and 2 sleeping bags and 14 paintings that might be nothing or might be everything, and the only thing she knew for certain was that she was not going anywhere. She went back inside. Della was sitting at the workbench reading one of the journals by lantern light. She did not look up when Mara came in. She turned a page. "He loved this room," Della said. Mara looked around it. The stone walls, the hemlock beams, the stove ticking as the metal cooled, the paintings leaning against the shelving in the same order Dr. Firth had left them, the 2 folding chairs facing each other. "I know," she said. She sat down in her chair and pulled the notebook toward her and opened it to a fresh page and started writing down everything she needed to do next. The fire burned low. She put another piece of wood on it. Outside the barn, the night came down over the ridge, and the clearing went dark and quiet, the way it had for 100 years before they arrived, and would for 100 years after, patient and indifferent to the small particular urgency of two girls making a life in the space a man had made for them before they knew they would need it. December came in hard that year, the way it sometimes did in the Kentucky mountains, not gradually but all at once, a week of gray sky, and then a morning when the ground was frozen solid and stayed that way. Mara learned the woodstove's rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of anything you depend on completely. How much wood it needed to hold heat through the night, how long it took to bring the room from cold to bearable in the early morning, the particular sound it made when the draw was good, and the particular sound it made when it wasn't. She learned to split kindling with the hatchet she found on the pegboard above the workbench. She learned that her hands could do things she had not previously asked them to do. Della adapted the way she adapted to everything, which was to treat the new conditions as simply the current conditions and proceed accordingly. She did her homework at the workbench by lantern light. She kept her half of the room organized. She did not complain about the cold or the inconvenience or the fact that showering required driving to the county recreation center 3 mornings a week before school. She was 15 years old, and she was tougher than anyone who had not seen her lately would have believed. Mara watched her sister and thought about their grandfather's journal entry, the one about Della's habit of listening without speaking until she had something specific to say. He had seen that too. He had seen both of them clearly, in the way that people are seen when someone is paying attention not to who they want you to be, but to who you actually are. She thought about that distinction a great deal in December. The authentication process had begun. Dr. Firth had taken high-resolution photographs of all 14 works back to Knoxville and was working through her preliminary assessment. She had recommended an art law attorney in Nashville named Marcus Webb, who handled estate and collection matters, and who had agreed to a consultation in early December. Mr. Pruitt had connected Mara with a second attorney in Lexington who specialized in estate disputes, because it had become clear that the collection's existence was going to raise questions about the terms of her grandfather's will and what, exactly, had been included in the estate her father had inherited versus what had been specifically designated to Mara through the barn deed. That question was not simple. The collection had been physically located in the barn. The barn was Mara's. But the will's language, drafted before the collection had reached its current scale, had not explicitly addressed it. Renee's attorney had already sent a letter to Mr. Pruitt suggesting that any contents of the property might be considered part of the estate that had transferred to her through her marriage to Mara's father. The letter was 2 pages long and written in the smooth, confident language of someone who had not yet understood what they were dealing with. Mr. Pruitt had read it and set it down and said, "This is going to be a conversation." Mara had said, "Let it be a conversation then. I'm not moving anything." She had not told Renee about the paintings. She had not told her Aunt Cecily. She had not told anyone except the people who needed to know in order to help her. She understood instinctively, the way her grandfather had understood it, that silence was a form of protection and that the moment the scale of what was in that room became common knowledge, everything would become harder and louder and more complicated. She was not ready for harder and louder. She was still learning the basics. Marcus Webb drove up from Nashville on a Tuesday. He was a man in his 40s, well-dressed without being showy about it, with the kind of unhurried attentiveness that good attorneys and good doctors have in common. He sat at the workbench in the underground room and looked at the paintings for a long time before he said anything professional. Then he said, "Your grandfather was serious about this." "Yes," Mara said. "He spent 2 hours going through the documentation, the appraisal records, the correspondence with museum curators, the provenance files her grandfather had assembled for each work. He asked careful questions and made notes, and did not react visibly to anything he read, which she appreciated. At the end of the 2 hours he sat back and looked at her. "The legal situation is manageable," he said. "The barn deed is unambiguous. The contents of the barn were not inventoried as part of the estate that transferred through your father's inheritance, which means they were either part of the barn bequest or they existed in a separate legal category entirely. Given that your grandfather built the room himself and maintained exclusive access to it and never disclosed its contents to the general estate, there is a strong argument that the collection was always intended to be part of the barn bequest. I have seen weaker arguments prevail in court. What about Renee's claim? He was quiet for a moment. Her attorney is fishing. They do not know what is in here. They are making a general claim in hopes that it covers something valuable. When they discover the actual scope of what we are talking about, the claim will either become more aggressive or it will disappear entirely, depending on their assessment of their chances. Our job is to make sure our position is fully established before that moment comes. She nodded. How long does authentication take? For the full collection, done properly, 6 to 18 months. For a preliminary assessment sufficient to establish value for legal purposes, Dr. Firth believes she can have something substantive in 8 to 10 weeks. She has already sent 2 of the works, the landscape on the far left and the portrait in the blue dress, for technical analysis at a lab in New York. Mara thought about the portrait. The woman in the blue dress with the eyes that followed you. She said, "What do you think it is?" Marcus Webb looked at the empty space on the shelving where the painting had been before Dr. Firth took it. "I think," he said carefully, "that your grandfather spent 15 years tracking a provenance chain for a reason. I think he was not a man who invested 15 years in a thing unless he was confident. And I think Dr. Firth would not have sent it to New York in the first week unless she was seeing what he saw." He left in the early afternoon, and she went back to her notebook and added 3 pages of notes to what was already there. The legal letter from Renee's attorney arrived the following week, more formal this time and more specific. It claimed that the contents of the barn, as a structure on the Vayne property, should have been inventoried as part of the estate settlement, and that Mara's failure to disclose the room and its contents at the time of the original proceedings constituted a material omission. It demanded a full accounting of the room's contents within 30 days. Mr. Pruitt called her the morning it arrived. He sounded more energized than she had heard him. "They know something is there," he said. "They do not know what. Someone talked, a neighbor, perhaps, or they hired someone to look at the property. In any case, they are moving. We need to move first." They filed the counter-documentation that week, establishing the legal basis for Mara's claim to the room and its contents through the barn deed, supported by the architectural evidence that the room had been built as an integral part of the barn structure and therefore fell within the bequest. They filed a request for the court to recognize the collection as a separate estate item, pending authentication. They were fast and they were thorough, and when Renee's attorney received the counterfiling, the response took 11 days to come back, which Mr. Pruitt said was a good sign. In the meantime, Mara worked on the barn. Bert Caswell had come back with a revised estimate after Mara explained what she was trying to do, which was not just repair the roof, but make the structure livable. He had brought a younger man named Todd who did interior finish work, and the 2 of them had walked the space together and talked in low voices and made measurements and come back to her with a phased plan. The roof first, which was the structural priority. Then the east section, clearing and reframing the collapsed area. Then, if she chose, the conversion of the barn's main floor into a living space above the underground room. The phased estimate was significant. It was more than she had, but it was not more than she might have, depending on how things resolved. And Bert had said he was willing to start the roof work on a delayed payment arrangement, given that it had been Elias Vayne's barn and Elias Vayne had always been good for what he owed. She said yes to the roof. The crew started the second week of December. 4 men, Bert and Todd and 2 younger workers, on the barn from first light until the cold drove them off in the late afternoon. The sound of it filled the clearing from morning to evening, the groan and crack of old materials being removed, the clean percussion of new ones being placed. Mara worked alongside them when she could and watched when she couldn't and learned things she had not expected to learn about how a structure was put together and what made it last. Bert talked while he worked. He had known her grandfather for 30 years, and he talked about him the way the people in Jericho Springs had talked about Leo's grandfather in the old ranch, with the particular kind of affection reserved for men who were difficult to know but worth knowing. He said Elias Vayne had been the best finished carpenter in Harlan County when he was in his prime, and that he had stopped taking work in his last years because his hands had gotten unreliable and he would not do something he could not do well. He said he had helped Elias with a small project on the barn's exterior in 2003, and that Elias had been precise and demanding and had thanked him at the end of the day with a directness that felt like more than courtesy. He said he had always wondered why Elias cared so much about that particular barn. Mara listened and did not explain. Dr. Firth called on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of December. Mara was outside watching Bert's crew work on the east rafter line, and she stepped away from the noise to take the call. Dr. Firth's voice was measured in the way it had been during the visit, professionally careful, but there was something different underneath it that Mara heard and held on to. The technical analysis on the landscape came back this morning, she said. The paint layering and canvas composition are consistent with the attributed period, and the infrared reflectography shows underdrawing consistent with the artist's known working method. I am prepared to say, pending review of the full provenance documentation, that the attribution is solid. That painting is genuine. Mara stood in the frozen clearing with the sound of hammers behind her and said, "What does that mean in terms of value?" There was a brief pause. Dr. Firth said, "Comparable works by this artist have sold at auction in the last 5 years in a range between $400,000 and $1.2 million, depending on subject matter, condition, and provenance quality. Your grandfather's provenance documentation is exceptional. I would expect the upper end of that range to be realistic." Mara did not say anything. "That is one painting," Dr. Firth said. "Of 14. She was quiet again. Then she said, "The portrait. The blue dress." "Yes. The lab results are not back yet. I expect them in the new year. But I have now spent considerable time with the documentation your grandfather assembled, and I have consulted with 2 colleagues whose opinions I trust." She paused. "I do not want to tell you a number until the analysis is complete. What I will tell you is that if the attribution holds, the portrait is not in the same category as the landscape. It is in a different category entirely." Mara looked at the barn. The new metal roof was going on the western section, the steel panels catching the winter light and throwing it back in long, cold lines. The building looked different already. More solid. More like what it had always been underneath the years of neglect. She said, "How different?" Dr. Firth said, "The artist your grandfather believed painted that work has not had an authenticated previously unknown canvas appear on the market in over 2 decades. The last one sold at Sotheby's in London for $11 million. I am not telling you that is what this is worth. I am telling you that is the landscape of what we are dealing with if the analysis confirms the attribution." Mara pressed her hand flat against the cold barn wall beside her, the same way she had pressed her hand against the pine sheathing looking for the door. The wood was solid under her palm. The stone foundation beneath it had been set in 1898 and had not moved. She said, "Thank you, Dr. Firth. Please call me when the results come in." She hung up and stood against the barn wall for a while. The hammers kept going above her. Bert was calling instructions to the younger man in his unhurried way. A crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the clearing and regarded her briefly and flew off. She went inside and sat in the folding chair and looked at the empty spaces on the shelving where 2 of the 14 paintings had been. 12 remained, leaning against the shelving in their careful order. The woman in the blue dress was gone. In a laboratory in New York, her paint layers being read by instruments that could see things no eye could see. Her grandfather had found that painting somewhere. He had carried it home and examined it and looked at it for 15 years and written about it in his journals and written letters to museum curators about it, and kept it in this room he built in secret in a barn that everyone else thought was worthless. He had been right about it from the beginning, and he had never told anyone because telling anyone would have meant giving it up or defending it or having it taken from him before he was ready, and he was not ready until he was gone, until he had put it in Mara's hands. He had trusted her with something he had spent his whole life building. Not because she was the oldest grandchild or because inheritance protocol demanded it, but because he had watched her and decided she was the one who would see it clearly and hold it correctly and not be destroyed by it. She picked up his journal from the most recent year, the one from the spring before he died, and turned to the last entry. He had written it in March, 2 months before he passed. His handwriting was less steady than the earlier volumes, but still legible, still precise in its intention. He had written, "The room is ready. Everything is in order. I have done what I could with the time I had. I leave the rest to Mara, who sees the way a builder sees, and to Della, who listens the way a good architect listens, until the right moment to speak. I am not afraid of what happens next. I am only sorry I will not be there to watch it." She read it twice. She put the journal down. She was not going to cry. She was going to do what he had trained her to do without knowing he was training her, which was to see the situation clearly and decide what it required and do that thing. She picked up her notebook and started writing. Christmas was quiet. Mara had gotten a small tree from the lot in town and set it up in the corner of the room near the stove, and Della had strung lights on it from a set she found at the dollar store, and the combination of the lantern and the tree lights and the woodstove made the stone room feel, for that week at least, less like a shelter and more like somewhere chosen. Their Aunt Cecily called on Christmas Eve. Mara answered because she believed in answering calls even from people who had not earned the courtesy, because not answering was a decision made from feeling rather than strategy, and she was trying to make fewer of those. Cecily said she had heard from Renee that there was some kind of legal situation developing around the barn property. She said she hoped Mara understood that the family just wanted to make sure everything was handled fairly. She used the word family twice in a way that implied a unity that had not been in evidence on the day Renee locked the door. Mara said she appreciated the call and that her attorneys were handling everything and that she hoped Cecily had a good holiday. There was a pause. Then Cecily said, "Your grandfather was always very fond of you. You know that, right? Even if he had a strange way of showing it sometimes." Mara thought about the room, the stove, the kindling, the note on top of it that said, "I thought you might be cold. Start here." "He showed it fine," she said, and she ended the call. Della had been listening from the cot. She waited until Mara put the phone down, and then she said, "Was that Aunt Cecily trying to figure out what we have?" "Yes." She looked up from her book. "Are we going to tell her?" "No." "Good." She turned a page. "She has the same energy as a real estate agent who already sold the house to someone else." Mara laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes unexpectedly and lasts longer than you expect. Della smiled without looking up, satisfied. The lab results came back on the 9th of January. Dr. Firth called at 8 in the morning, which told Mara something before she said a word. "The analysis is complete," Dr. Firth said. "The technical findings are consistent with the attributed artist's documented working methods. The pigment composition matches materials available in the relevant period, and the canvas preparation is consistent with the artist's known practice. There is a signature, partially obscured by a later varnish layer, that the lab has imaged under raking light. It is consistent with authenticated examples." She paused. "Mara, your grandfather was right." Mara was standing in the clearing in the January cold, her breath visible in front of her, the barn behind her solid and silver gray with its new metal roof catching the early light. She said, "How confident are you?" Dr. Firth said, "Confident enough that I have already contacted 2 colleagues at major auction houses. They are both interested in seeing the full documentation and arranging their own review. This is not a process I would initiate unless I was prepared to stand behind the attribution professionally." Mara pressed her hand against the barn wall. She said, "What happens next?" Dr. Firth walked her through it. The formal authentication process. The legal establishment of clear title, which Marcus Webb was already preparing. The decision about how to handle the collection, whether to place individual works with separate auction houses or to approach a single house about representing the full collection, which would command more attention and potentially better terms. The timeline, which would be months, not weeks, but which was now moving with real momentum. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "Of course. What is the portrait worth?" "Your best honest estimate." Dr. Firth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I believe a properly conducted auction, with full authentication and appropriate marketing lead time, would place the portrait between $9 and $14 million. That is a wide range because the market for a newly discovered work by this artist is genuinely uncertain. There has not been one in 20 years. The interest will be significant." Mara looked at the ridge above the barn. The hardwoods were bare and black against the pale January sky, the same ridge her grandfather had looked at every day of his adult life. She said, "Thank you, Dr. Firth, for everything." She hung up and stood in the cold for a long time. Then she went inside and woke up her sister. The legal resolution came in February. Renee's claim was withdrawn 17 days after Marcus Webb filed the full authentication documentation with the court, establishing not only the legal basis for Mara's ownership of the collection, but the collection's preliminary assessed value. The withdrawal came without explanation, which was the kind of explanation that needed no words. The attorneys on the other side had done the math and decided that fighting over a portion of something this significant, against a legal position this solid, was not a battle they could win. Mr. Pruitt called her the morning the withdrawal was filed. He said, "It is over on that front." She could hear something in his voice that she understood was not just professional satisfaction. She said, "Mr. Pruitt, did you know what was in there?" When he gave you the barn deed to include in the will, did you know what he was leaving me? A long pause. He knew you would find it, he said finally. He trusted the deed would do the rest. She understood that was as direct an answer as she was going to get, and she accepted it. She called Bert Caswell the same day and told him to proceed with the second phase. The east section, the interior conversion. All of it. He said, "You found something good in that barn, didn't you?" She said, "My grandfather left something there for me to find." Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He was a good man, Elias Vayne. He said it the way people say things they have been waiting to say for a while. "I always thought he was tending to something out here that none of us understood." He was, she said. The auction took place in April, 7 months after the morning Mara and Della had sat in the car in Renee's driveway with a trash bag of clothes and nowhere to go. Not all 14 works. 4 of them, selected in consultation with Dr. Firth and Marcus Webb as the strongest candidates for the current market, the landscape, one of the genre scenes, one of the portraits, and the woman in the blue dress. Mara did not attend in person. She watched the feed from a laptop on the workbench in the underground room, with Della beside her on the second folding chair and Mr. Pruitt standing near the doorway with his coat still on, having driven up from Harlan that morning because he had said he wanted to be there when it happened. The landscape sold first, $480,000, toward the upper end of Dr. Firth's range, the bidding competitive and resolved in under 3 minutes. The genre scene sold for $220,000. The portrait sold for $640,000. Then the woman in the blue dress. The bidding opened at $3 million and climbed. Mara watched the numbers on the screen and did not speak. Della had her hand over her mouth. Mr. Pruitt had stopped moving entirely. It sold at $11.4 million. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Della said, in a voice that was completely steady and almost academic, "That's more than the gross domestic product of some small countries." Mara looked at the screen for another moment. Then she looked at her sister. Then she looked at Mr. Pruitt, who was looking back at her with an expression she could not fully read, but which contained, she thought, something close to the satisfaction of a man who had kept a long secret and finally been allowed to set it down. She said, "I need some air." She went outside. The April evening was warm enough that she did not need a coat. The clearing was green now, the grasses coming back from the frost, the ridgeline behind the barn showing the first haze of new leaves against the sky. The barn stood in the last light of the day, the new metal roof glinting, the old silver-gray siding beneath it, the structure solid and enormous and entirely, legally, irrevocably hers. She stood in the clearing and thought about her grandfather. She thought about a man who had spent 40 years doing something important in silence, in a room he built with his own hands, without telling anyone, because telling anyone would have changed what he was doing, and he was not willing to have it changed. She thought about the patience that required and the loneliness it must have held and the particular kind of faith it expressed, not faith in luck or fortune, but faith in the specific person he was leaving it for, faith that she would come, that she would find it, that she would know what to do. She thought about the note on top of the kindling. "I thought you might be cold. Start here." She had started there. She was still starting there. Every morning she woke up in that room with the fire to build and the day to make, and she started there, with the smallest necessary thing, and worked outward from it. The remaining 10 paintings were staying. She had decided that with Marcus Webb's guidance, some of them might be sold over time, as the right circumstances presented themselves. Some of them she thought she might keep. The collection had not been built to be liquidated all at once. It had been built over a lifetime, and it could be tended over a lifetime. She was going to restore the barn properly. Not convert it into something it wasn't, but restore it to what it was, to what it had been when it was a working structure full of animals and sound, and the daily business of a farm in operation. She was going to fix the east section fully and put new siding on the south wall and rehang the main doors so they both slid cleanly. She was going to make the underground room permanent, with real heating and real lighting and a door that opened and closed with the ease of something maintained rather than something neglected. She and Della were going to live here, not in the underground room forever, but in the barn, in a space built above it, designed properly, with a builder who understood old structures. She had already spoken to Todd about it. He had drawn some preliminary sketches. The drawings were careful and respectful of the original framing, the way her grandfather had been careful and respectful of everything he touched. Della was going to finish high school at Harlan County High and then go wherever she chose to go, without owing anyone anything, without the particular anxiety that comes from knowing there is nothing to fall back on. That anxiety was gone now. Mara had felt it leave the morning the auction closed, like a pressure that had been so constant she had stopped noticing it until it was absent. She was going to set up a small foundation. She had not worked out the details yet, but the intention was clear. Something for girls in situations like the one she and Della had been in 6 months ago, kicked out with a trash bag and no map. Something that would not fix the situation entirely because nothing fixed the situation entirely, but that would do what her grandfather's room had done for her, which was to put something solid underfoot at the moment when there was nothing. She did not know yet what she would call it. She thought she might call it the door. She heard Della come out of the barn behind her. Her sister came and stood beside her in the clearing, not speaking, which was Della's way. They stood together looking at the barn in the fading light. After a while, Della said, "He would have liked seeing this." Mara thought about that. About the photograph of him at the workbench, the younger man with the wide smile, building something in a room he had made in secret for the people who would come after him. "I think he already did," she said. "I think this is exactly what he was seeing the whole time." The light went the way it went in the mountains, from gold to gray to the deep, particular blue of full dark, and the barn went dark against it. And the new roof held the last of the light, the longest, a line of silver at the ridge. Before that too went dark. They went back inside. The woodstove was still warm from the morning. Mara put 2 pieces of wood on the coals, and the flames came back up easily, the way they did now that she knew how to tend them, and the room filled with warmth and the smell of burning oak, and the lantern light moved on the stone walls, and the 12 remaining paintings leaned against the shelving in their careful order, and outside the barn the April night settled over the mountain and the clearing and the 1/4 acre of ground that had always been, from the moment her grandfather decided it exactly hers. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.